Hi, everybody, and welcome to the HSI YouTube channel. Today, I am talking to Lise Palmer, a graduate from the HSI Master's Program at Concordia, and we're going to talk about bringing to light hidden assumptions in organizational systems. Lise, before we get started, maybe you would like to introduce yourself a bit more to the folks who are watching.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I graduated from the HSI program in 2011 and have had my own consulting practice called Spark since then. I started out doing general process consulting and strategic planning and things like that, and have gradually focused my practice on workplace culture. Sometimes democratic culture change, but more often simply identifying insights about a workplace culture and how that can help the organization reach a goal or make a change. That's me.
Great. Okay. So, yeah, workplace culture. And that obviously makes it very relevant that you're interested in things like hidden assumptions. So, first of all, Lise, before we start talking about how to try to get at assumptions that are hidden within a cultural system, why is this important? Why has this become an important part of your practice?
I would say for two reasons. One is when you're trying to help an organization address an issue or create a change, sometimes everything they're trying is just not working, and it's puzzling as to why. Things tend not to get engagement or they fizzle. Um, and sometimes then I found it's actually an underlying assumption at work that is difficult to figure out. But once you know about it, you're able to succeed in making the change. One example of a project I worked on like that was I was helping a university to reduce sexual violence on campus, and that's a topic that everyone was saying we think that's so important. But we were just getting really low engagement on the issue. We'd send out an invitation to an event and people wouldn't show up, the same people who said it was really important. So we started to look into why that might be, that incongruity between what people were saying and what people were doing, and found a hidden assumption at work, actually, which was so helpful to realize, which is that people basically felt that sexual violence is just something that happens. It's not something that you can prevent or reduce the frequency of. And so having that kind of awareness of a subconscious belief that was very prevalent on campus totally changed our strategy. So I think that's one example of the importance of understanding
Right.
hidden assumptions. I'd say a second example I'll tell you about is I did some research for a cooperative banking institution, and looking at how they changed over a 17-year period from kind of a radical cooperative organization that had a social change mission to really what was today a bank with customers rather than members. And so I traced the kind of evolution of their underlying assumptions about what they were for, what their raison d'être really was, and found, originally they had a kind of underlying assumption that drove all their work around our members being what's most important. And then that shifted to making money for our members is what's most important.
Oh,
And
interesting.
eventually that became making money is what's most important, with the kind of for our members in brackets. And the result was that members, the money was being reinvested in the expansion of the bank as an enterprise, and not given back to members. So I think it's a very important thing to be able to understand these underlying assumptions and how that can drive the whole orientation of an organization.
Well, thank you for sharing those specific examples. For me, I have the luxury of being an academic, and I get to walk around and as I'm walking the dog and ponder what for me are big questions. And one of the things that seems increasingly apparent to me is that the way that we act in organizational settings or wherever, the way that we act, the behavior that we produce arises in part out of our mindsets, out of the way that we think about the world. And so, I think we have a tendency maybe sometimes to think that, all right, so I have a goal, I set goals, I form intentions, and then I produce behavior that is consistent with those goals and intentions. So, behavior consistent to what I'm thinking. And so I should be able to achieve whatever it is that I want to achieve. And yet we find that sometimes that doesn't seem to happen as easily as we think. And from that, we infer that there are aspects of our thinking that are in a way concealed from us, and that's what these hidden assumptions are. So one thing I'm curious about then is, these things are so important, and working with some organizational client systems, an important step becomes to bring into the light of day the existence of these particular assumptions, allow people to consider them. What are some of the ways that you have, some of the techniques, some of the methods that you have used to help organizational members see something in their own cognitive patterns that are concealed from them or concealed from many of them?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's obviously the trickiest part. These assumptions are kind of taken for granted, and often not only hard for people to notice or articulate, but even if you suggest it to people, because it's taken for granted, a belief that you've never examined and just seems very natural to you, it can be hard to have a conversation about it. I guess Edgar Schein has some interesting work on this with his 3-level culture model, where he has the pyramid, and at the top is artifacts, or what people say, very easily observable things, and the next level down is espoused values. And sometimes when there's conflicts between those 2 levels, you can go down to the 3rd level and find out that there's an underlying assumption, as he calls it, hidden assumption underlying, that is driving that conflict. And so for me, a big hint about an important underlying assumption, because we have these all the time about things, but one that it's important to maybe understand a little bit better is a conflict between those 2 levels. Or, Argyris talks about espoused theory versus theory in use.
Right.
So when those 2 are in conflict, sometimes there's an interesting assumption driving that. And I think, you can get at those in different ways. I mean, sometimes you can ask people directly about them and kind of tease out, what the underlying assumptions could be, especially in a group context with a good discussion. But sometimes it's really difficult, because people might give you a sort of blank stare if you ask people about that. And I think that's actually a clue that you're onto something, because it indicates you're asking about something that is so part of the fabric of how people see things that they've never questioned it before. It doesn't seem like a debatable sort of topic. It seems like that's just the way the world works. There's an ethnographer, Karen Ho, who did some really interesting work looking at how people see the corporation, the corporate entity, and how that's evolved over the decades. 30 years ago or 40 years ago, people saw, the reason for, the purpose of a corporation as multifold. There's making money for shareholders, but there's also providing jobs for employees and a good work environment, contributing to the local community, and having a service or product that is needed, in the world. And the kind of purpose of the corporation was seen as a coming together of all of these elements. And gradually over decades, she's shown how people's concept of a corporation has narrowed to really being focused on making money for shareholders.
Right.
And she calls this the shareholder value orientation.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is how people's, hidden assumptions about what a corporation is even for has changed. So when she was doing a research, she would ask people, what's a corporation for? And she would get these blank stares before people could articulate, well, of course it's for making money for shareholders. Yeah, but I guess, the other technique that I find really interesting, aside from talking to people or interviewing them, is actually doing some observation, ethnographic style observation, hanging around, and seeing what you notice. For the work I did with the cooperative bank, I spent a lot of time in their innovation lab, a kind of interesting space that they launched. And they, did a lot of publicity and branding talking about what this space was. So I had a lot of material to analyze in terms of the espoused values or the artifacts, the presentation of their space. They said, this is a place where you can be inside our cooperative bank. You can be an insider and see what it's like inside. There's a real strong message about, coming and sharing the kind of inner workings of this place. But as I hung around the space, I saw more and more ways in which it was a very closed space, and there were lots of mechanisms to kind of keep people out. There were
Okay.
security and locked doors in the areas where work really got done. And I think what was most interesting is I visited this space over time, from early in its launch until about a year later. And because furniture was movable in this kind of cool futuristic space, the space actually changed so that originally there was kind of a large open space where anyone could go and participate and hang around. And that space shrunk by about 80% over the course of the year, with the welcome desk moving further and further up, and shifting from something that was a welcome desk to something more like a barrier with a sort of person behind it to make sure you didn't go in. So, I mean, that was really fascinating, and
Right.
helped me to see, okay, there's some very interesting conflicts at play here between insiders and outsiders, and what are the underlying assumptions here.
I just want to say, when you were talking about this notion of the corporation existing to maximize shareholder value, one of the things that comes up for me is one of the people who brought that notion into being is a Harvard economist named Mike Jensen, who published quite widely and whose work was very, very highly regarded. And some people, in fact, when they think of that phrase, they think of him, they attribute it to him, and that was one of his main contributions. And I can say that something that I find very interesting is that Mike Jensen, later on in the 2000s, noticing the tremendous scandals that were occurring in some large American corporations. I mean, basically the fraud and the theft that was being carried out by organizational leaders, with the Enron scandal from several years ago and then many since then. Jensen became appalled at what this orientation that he had helped bring into being, what it was actually producing in the world, and became extremely interested in approaches to leadership development that would mitigate this dreadful problem of greed that was that he felt anyhow was in part being produced as a result of the mindset that he had helped to create. And so
Wow.
once again, this business about mindset and behavior.
I'll just add a little anecdote, which is I became very interested in this topic some years ago when I observed a get-together between high-level executives of a Fortune 500 company. And I was just observing them in this session, but they got into a discussion that was really an ethical discussion about what the right thing to do is when you have a need for layoffs, for efficiency, but you're human, so you feel bad about that. And what was interesting to me was, the clear right answer for everyone was you never take, human considerations into your decision.
Oh, wow.
Because to do the right thing and be ethical, it's all about the shareholder and building profit for them.
Wow.
And it was very striking because I really got the sense that these people were taking the time to really ethically puzzle through what's the right thing to do in a good place, coming from a good place. And arrived at such a kind of what I would call unfortunate or maybe even unethical stance. So, and that hidden assumption about what a corporation is for drove that and gave them what they felt was no option to act differently.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That if the mindset is a certain way, then even an attempt to be reflective and to be a good and decent person can produce results that that we might come to regret. It's in my opinion, it's something that we should all think about from time to time. Those of us who are interventionists, who try to bring about change, a social ecological perspective suggests to me anyhow that we should be open to the likelihood that our actions will produce unintended consequences, and some of those unintended consequences could be negative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, look, I also want to respond a bit to that framework that you were presenting earlier, the SHINE framework, and you brought in Chris Argyris, and your description of some of the ways that you proceed remind me a little bit of some of the suggestions that Argyris makes in some of his work, where he talks about interviewing people and observing things and creating, he calls it an action map of the behavioral patterns that are observed, and then presenting this action map to members of the client system, so now they can see that which has been hidden from them before, and resulting in a conversation and possibly a desire to change. Now, you and I talked a little bit about a couple of more recent scholars, Keegan and Leahy, who have developed what they call the immunity to change model that they are continuing to develop. And what I find interesting about their model is that they essentially agree with much of what Shine says and what Argyris says, except they claim that Shine and especially Argyris missed one very important thing. They say that these espoused values that are characteristic of an organization, that's very real. Organizational leaders and organizational members will have things that they aspire to, and usually they're things that are, admirable within the culture that they're operating in. These are good things, decent things that they aspire to. Yet over time, they notice we don't get them. We don't actually achieve them. We don't make enough progress on them. And so what on earth is going on? What are the barriers? Keegan and Leahy say that for Argyris, it is simply this clash of two different models, as he calls it, as Argyris called it, Model 1 and Model 2, a tendency toward unilateral control, wanting to be in control of things, as opposed to a tendency of wanting to be open and collaborative with others. Keegan and Leahy say that's not the whole story. They say that, in fact, what's actually going on is that people below the surface have other commitments to other things that do not coexist with the original commitment, with the espoused commitment. And we're not aware of it. So as we are trying to act on the espoused commitment, we are violating the hidden commitment. As we try to act on the hidden commitment, we're violating the espoused commitment. And so they say the key is to bring the hidden commitments into the light of day. And of course, as you probably know, they've developed this very simple, very usable framework that allows people to step through their espoused goal, and then what they actually are doing when, instead of acting on their espoused goal, and then what thinking might be lying below the surface there. And many people have found this to be an extremely useful way of trying to understand what it is that prevents some organizations, some teams, and some individuals from acting on their aspirations. Once again, it's hidden assumptions, they call it hidden commitments, but ultimately big assumptions that are hidden from view.
I think that's really useful. And one of the steps that they offer in the immunity to change model that I think is really helpful, that I don't see elsewhere, is, once you've identified some of those competing commitments, you're asked to test out, research, find out, is that true or not? And of course, everyone at first feels, well, of course it's true. But, being asked always to go through. And so, if we take the example of, people at a university being asked, they've identified, okay, I actually don't feel that sexual violence is something that we can reduce. It just happens. If you test that out quite quickly, you can see that there's research demonstrating that it can be reduced, and there's certain effective actions that can be taken. And so yeah, I think just their framing of that step is really nice, because I think it helps people to not be defensive and to be willing to really examine whether something is true, and then the kind of curtain can fall away quite quickly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. That's one of the things that I like about the framework. What you just said is the curtain can fall away quickly. The way that they describe it is you run these tests, as you were saying, to test the assumption. And the way that a person would think about this is, oh, okay, I'm going to run some tests, and if the tests show that the assumption is not necessary, now I can put in place a plan to get rid of the assumption. But what tends to happen is by running the tests, you get rid of the assumption. So once you've run the test, there's no more work to be done. It's gone. You just got to get used to living in what they call an expanded world.
Mm-hmm.
Lise, you probably heard a little bell go on my computer just a moment ago. That's reminding me of something else that I need to get to. Before we close this out, I just want to see if there's any final comment, any final thing you'd like to say about what we were talking about today about bringing to light hidden assumptions.
I guess if I can get up on my soapbox, my last chance, I think one more reason why it's so important to get at these hidden assumptions in organizations and in our society, is to think about any concerns you have about the world and how those are playing out in organizations. For me, I'm really concerned about climate change and increasing inequalities. And I think the way we think about the role of corporations today is a big driver in what's happening. They've become very financialized, very financially focused.
Mm-hmm.
And this is affecting other organizations too. Cooperatives and nonprofits, I think, are having a tougher time staying focused on a mission that's not financial than ever before. So I think there's a lot of really important work for us to do out there in helping organizations to unravel hidden assumptions and other, beliefs and values that might be holding them back from creating meaningful change in the world. So I think it's an exciting area to work in.
Exciting and important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I hope we'll have a chance to have a discussion again in the future.
Thanks, Jamie.
Okay.